Your wedding day. They tell you it's the happiest day of your life. The photos show you smiling, surrounded by loved ones, stepping into what everyone assures you is the ultimate achievement of human existence. But here's what Friedrich Nietzsche understood that nobody at that wedding will ever tell you. The moment you say, "I do," you're committing an act of self-betrayal so profound that you'll spend the rest of your life either denying it happened or slowly suffocating under the weight of what you've agreed to. I'm not talking about whether your spouse is a good person or whether you love them. I'm talking about something far more fundamental. I'm talking about the death of possibility itself, the closing of every door except one, the voluntary amputation of futures you'll never get to live. And Nietzsche, that brilliant madman who saw through every comfortable lie civilization tells itself, he recognized marriage for exactly what it is: society's most effective tool for domesticating the exceptional and reducing the extraordinary to the mediocre. Let me tell you about a conversation I had 3 months ago that crystallized everything Nietzsche tried to warn us about. I was at a high school reunion, and I ran into Marcus, someone I'd known as the most ambitious, creative, borderline dangerous person in our class. The guy who was going to change the world, who had ideas that made teachers uncomfortable, who lived with an intensity that made everyone else seem half asleep. 20 years later, he's working a job he hates to pay for a house he can barely afford. His eyes have this dead quality I'd never seen in him before. And when someone asked him about his dreams, about the things he used to talk about with such passion, he just laughed this hollow laugh and said, "Yeah, well, life happens." Life didn't happen to Marcus. Marriage happened to Marcus. The domestication process that Nietzsche described with such precision, it happened to him exactly as Nietzsche predicted it would. And the worst part? He can't even admit it was a mistake, because admitting that would mean confronting the fact that he voluntarily walked into a cage and locked the door behind him. I need to know something before we continue down this path. Where are you right now? What city are you watching this from? Are you in Los Angeles, surrounded by the wreckage of Hollywood marriages that prove even wealth and fame can't make this institution work? Paris, where even the romance capital of the world has divorce rates that reveal the truth beneath the mythology. Singapore, where social pressure to marry is so intense that questioning it feels like treason. São Paulo, watching friends disappear into marriages one by one like soldiers walking into fog. Drop your city in the comments, because your cultural context determines exactly how much courage it takes to even consider what we're about to discuss. Nietzsche's philosophy centered on what he called life affirmation, the idea that we should embrace existence fully, pursue excellence, become who we truly are, rather than what society expects us to be. And marriage, at least as it's traditionally structured, is fundamentally opposed to this entire project. Marriage demands that you become smaller, safer, more predictable. It requires you to abandon the pursuit of your highest potential in favor of maintaining domestic harmony. It asks you to sacrifice the extraordinary life you might have lived for the ordinary life that everyone can understand and approve of. And here's the really insidious part. It makes you complicit in your own diminishment by framing this sacrifice as virtue, as love, as maturity. Think about what happens to a man's ambitions after marriage. Before, he might have dreamed of starting a revolutionary company, creating groundbreaking art, making discoveries that would change his field, living in different countries to expand his understanding of human possibility. After marriage, those dreams get recalibrated. Now the dream is a promotion that comes with better benefits, a house in a good school district, a retirement plan that's adequately funded. These aren't inherently bad things, but they're the dreams of a domesticated animal, not of a free human being pursuing his potential. Nietzsche would look at this transformation and see exactly what he described: the conversion of the exceptional into the mediocre through the mechanism of social pressure disguised as love. Nietzsche wrote about the last man, his term for the final stage of human devolution, a creature who's given up on greatness entirely and instead pursues only comfort, security, and the avoidance of difficulty. The last man doesn't want to be challenged or transformed. He just wants to be comfortable. And marriage, in its modern form, is a factory for producing last men. It takes individuals who might have been capable of extraordinary things and turns them into people whose greatest ambition is to maintain the status quo, to keep everyone comfortable, to avoid disruption at all costs. The married man stops asking, "What could I become?" and starts asking, "How do I keep this stable?" And that shift, from becoming to maintaining, is the death of everything Nietzsche valued. But here's where it gets really dark, and this is what most people never confront honestly. Many married men know this. Deep down, beneath all the rationalizations and performances of contentment, they know they've betrayed themselves. They know that saying "I do" was the moment they gave up on their actual potential in favor of social approval and the promise of security. And this knowledge, this awareness that they've voluntarily chosen a smaller life than they were capable of, it creates a specific kind of psychological poison that Nietzsche called ressentiment. It's resentment turned inward, becoming a permanent feature of your psyche, poisoning everything you think and feel. The married man with ressentiment doesn't just resent his wife or his obligations. He resents himself for accepting them. He resents the society that convinced him this was the right path. He resents the younger version of himself who believed the lies. He resents everyone who's still free, because their freedom is a constant reminder of what he's given up. And because this resentment can't be expressed directly without destroying his life, it gets channeled into passive aggression, into judging others, into slow-burning bitterness that permeates his entire existence. Nietzsche saw this pattern everywhere he looked. Men who'd allowed themselves to be domesticated, and then spent the rest of their lives radiating quiet desperation while insisting they were happy. Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, the overman or higher human, is fundamentally incompatible with traditional marriage. The Übermensch creates his own values rather than accepting society's values. He constantly overcomes himself, transcending his current limitations to become something greater. He lives dangerously, takes risks, pursues excellence even when it's uncomfortable or socially unacceptable. Can you do any of this while managing a mortgage, coordinating school schedules, and making sure you're home for family dinner? Can you become who you're capable of becoming while your primary obligation is to maintain stability for people who depend on you? Nietzsche would say no, categorically no. The project of becoming your highest self and the project of being a conventional husband and father are mutually exclusive. This isn't about whether you can love someone or build a life with a partner. It's about the specific legal, social, and psychological structure of marriage as an institution. Marriage isn't just a relationship. It's a contract that gives society and the state enormous power over your life. It's a set of legally enforceable obligations that constrain your choices. It's a social role with rigid expectations about how you should think, feel, and behave. And it's a psychological cage that makes you complicit in your own imprisonment by telling you that the cage is actually freedom, that the chains are actually love, that your diminishment is actually growth. Nietzsche watched his friends and colleagues get married, and he documented what happened to them. Men who had been intellectually vibrant became dull. Artists whose work had been provocative and dangerous started producing safe commercial material that wouldn't upset anyone. Philosophers who had pursued truth fearlessly started self-censoring to avoid domestic conflict. The pattern was so consistent that Nietzsche concluded it wasn't coincidental. Marriage wasn't just compatible with mediocrity, it actively produced it. It took people with potential and systematically ground them down into comfortable, conventional versions of themselves that no longer threatened anyone or challenged anything. And the biggest regret, the one that Nietzsche understood married men carry but almost never admit, isn't that they chose the wrong person. It's that they chose to choose at all, that they agreed to close off all other possibilities forever, that they said yes to a system designed to make them smaller, safer, more manageable, that they betrayed their own potential for the comfort of conformity. This regret is different from normal regret because you can't fix it without destroying everything you've built. You can't go back, you can't undo it. You have to live with the knowledge that you chose the cage, and now the cage is your life. Nietzsche also recognized that society celebrates marriage so enthusiastically precisely because it's such an effective mechanism of control. A married man with children can't rebel against unjust systems because he has hostages to fortune. He can't pursue risky ventures because he needs stability. He can't dedicate himself fully to any passionate pursuit because he has obligations that consume his time and energy. He's been successfully domesticated, neutered, rendered safe, and society rewards this neutering with approval, with status markers like nice houses and family photos, with the title of responsible adult. But Nietzsche would look at this reward system and see it for what it is: treats given to animals who've learned to perform tricks and stay in their kennels. The transformation that marriage enacts is so complete that most men don't even recognize themselves a decade in. Nietzsche wrote about the will to power, the fundamental drive in all living things to assert themselves, to grow, to overcome obstacles and become more than they currently are. Marriage systematically suppresses this will to power. Every impulse to take a big risk gets filtered through. But what about the family? Every ambition that would require significant disruption gets abandoned because disruption threatens stability. Every aspect of yourself that doesn't fit the role of provider and protector gets suppressed until eventually it atrophies completely. You don't just stop pursuing greatness, you stop being capable of even imagining it. Nietzsche had particular contempt for what he called herd morality, the value system that prioritizes conformity, safety, and collective comfort over individual excellence and authentic self-expression. And marriage is perhaps the ultimate expression of herd morality. Everyone does it. Everyone says it's what you're supposed to do. Everyone who questions it gets treated as defective or immature. The herd pressure to marry is so intense that resisting it requires extraordinary strength of will, the kind of strength that Nietzsche himself possessed but that he recognized was rare. Most people, confronted with the combined pressure of family expectations, social norms, biological urges, and romantic mythology, simply capitulate. They get married not because they've carefully considered whether it serves their highest development, but because everyone else is doing it, and not doing it feels too difficult. What makes the regret so profound is that marriage comes with an enormous sunk cost that makes it nearly impossible to exit once you realize the mistake. You've spent tens of thousands on a wedding. You've legally entangled your finances. You've made promises in front of everyone you know. You've probably had children. You've built an entire life structure around this choice. And so even when you realize that saying "I do" was the moment you betrayed your potential, even when you understand that you've chosen mediocrity over excellence, even when you can feel yourself getting smaller and deader with each passing year, the costs of admitting the mistake and correcting it are so astronomical that most men choose to just endure. They live out their lives in quiet desperation, as Thoreau said, performing contentment while dying inside. Nietzsche observed that Christianity, which he viewed as a slave morality designed to make people docile and controllable, had deeply influenced Western conceptions of marriage. The idea that suffering is noble, that self-sacrifice is virtuous, that denying your own needs for others is the highest good. All of this Christian baggage gets imported into marriage, and it creates men who feel guilty for wanting anything for themselves, who view their own ambitions and desires as selfish, who've internalized the idea that being a good husband and father means making themselves smaller. Nietzsche tried to liberate people from this guilt-based morality, to show them that pursuing excellence and becoming your highest self isn't selfish. It's the most valuable thing any human can do. But married men have usually drunk too deeply from the well of sacrifice as virtue to hear this message. The regret also stems from what Nietzsche called eternal recurrence, his thought experiment about whether you could bear to live your exact same life over and over forever. Nietzsche used this as a test of life affirmation. If you couldn't bear the thought of living your life again exactly as it is, then you're not truly living, you're enduring. And here's the brutal question for married men. If you had to live your exact life again, make all the same choices, experience all the same limitations and sacrifices, would you? Could you? Most married men, if they're honest, would have to say no. They might love specific moments with their children or their spouse, but the totality of it, the decades of suppressed ambitions, unfulfilled potential, daily compromises, and slow death of possibility, they couldn't choose it again. Which means by Nietzsche's standard, they're not actually living lives worthy of affirmation. Nietzsche also warned about what he called the spirit of gravity, the forces that pull us down, that make us heavy and earthbound when we could be light and soaring. Marriage is pure spirit of gravity. It weighs you down with obligations, responsibilities, expectations, debts. It keeps you tied to the ground when you might have learned to fly. Every mortgage payment is gravity. Every school event you have to attend is gravity. Every compromise you make to keep peace is gravity. And the accumulation of all this gravity over years and decades creates men who've completely forgotten what it felt like to be light, to be free, to have their time and energy and potential fully their own. The wedding itself is a ritual of domestication that Nietzsche would have found darkly comic. Everyone dresses up in costumes that signal conformity. You make vows that are designed to bind you permanently. Your family and friends witness the moment of your capture and applaud it. You're given gifts to help you build your cage more comfortably. And then you go on a honeymoon, a brief period of pretend freedom before you return to begin your sentence. The whole ceremony is society celebrating another successful domestication, another free individual successfully contained, another potential threat to the status quo neutralized through the mechanism of family obligation. Nietzsche wrote that, "The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. Marriage is the tribe's victory. It's the moment when the individual stops struggling and accepts absorption into the collective. You stop being a person and become a unit. Your individual desires become subordinate to family needs. Your identity gets subsumed into roles: husband, father, provider. And the tribe celebrates this absorption because individuals are unpredictable and potentially disruptive, but family units are stable and controllable. They have too much to lose to rock the boat. They've been successfully integrated into the system. The regret married men feel but rarely admit isn't just about missed opportunities or roads not taken. It's about the fundamental betrayal of their own nature. Nietzsche believed humans were capable of continuous self-overcoming, of constantly transcending their current limitations to become something greater. But marriage creates stability, and stability is the enemy of transformation. You can't radically transform yourself when you have a spouse who married you, expecting you to remain fundamentally the same. You can't undergo the kind of psychological death and rebirth that growth often requires when you have children, depending on your consistency. You can't burn down your life and rebuild it from scratch when you're legally and financially entangled with systems that punish disruption. Nietzsche also understood that regret itself can become a form of poison if it's not acknowledged and processed. The married man who can't admit his regret, who has to keep performing satisfaction while carrying this knowledge of self-betrayal, that man develops what Nietzsche called a slave mentality. He learns to resent those who are free while insisting he doesn't want freedom. He criticizes others for pursuing the very things he wishes he could pursue. He becomes invested in pulling others down to his level, because their success or freedom is an unbearable reminder of what he's given up. This is why married men often become the harshest critics of alternative lifestyles. It's not that they genuinely believe conventional marriage is superior. It's that they need to believe it to justify their own choices and suppress their own regret. The really cruel aspect is that the regret often doesn't fully surface until it's far too late to do anything about it. In your 20s and 30s, you're still caught up in the romance and the building phase. You're too busy to reflect deeply on whether this is the life you actually want. It's usually in your 40s or 50s when mortality becomes real, and you start asking what you've actually accomplished with your life. That's when the regret crashes over you with full force. And by then, you've got 20 or 30 years invested, kids who are halfway through childhood, a financial structure that would be devastating to dismantle, a social identity completely built around being a family man. The costs of admitting the mistake and trying to correct it are so enormous that most men just suppress the regret and push forward, hoping they can make it to death without having to fully confront what they've done to themselves. Nietzsche's concept of amor fati, the love of fate, suggests that we should embrace our lives completely, including the difficult and painful parts. But there's a difference between embracing challenges that make you stronger and embracing chains that make you weaker. The married man who tries to practice amor fati with a life that's fundamentally constraining his potential isn't achieving Nietzschean self-affirmation. He's just rationalizing his prison. Learning to love his chains because the alternative, admitting he chose wrong, is too psychologically devastating to bear. The regret also compounds because marriage doesn't just affect you, it affects who your children become. Nietzsche worried about the reproduction of mediocrity, about average people raising average children who would raise average children in an endless cycle of diminishment. The married man who's suppressed his own potential, who's learned to value security over excellence, who's made peace with mediocrity, he teaches these same values to his children, not through explicit lessons, but through the model of his life. His kids learn that dreams are things you abandon, that ambition is something to be tempered, that the safe path is the smart path, and so the regret includes not just what he's done to himself, but what he's teaching his children to do to themselves. Nietzsche's philosophy demands what he called the revaluation of all values, the willingness to question everything society has taught you and determine for yourself what's actually valuable. But marriage makes this nearly impossible, because you've already committed to society's primary value system. You've agreed that stability is more important than transformation, that comfort is more valuable than growth, that maintaining what you have matters more than becoming what you could be. Once you've made that fundamental commitment, revaluating values becomes not just difficult, but threatening. If you seriously questioned whether marriage serves human flourishing, you'd have to confront that your entire life structure might be built on a flawed premise. Most men's psyches simply can't handle that level of upheaval, so they never allow themselves to seriously question it. The married man's regret is also intertwined with what Nietzsche called bad conscience, the internalized guilt and self-punishment that civilization uses to control individuals. You feel guilty for having regrets because you're supposed to be grateful for your family. You feel guilty for wanting more because you're supposed to be content with what you have. You feel guilty for looking at your single or childless friends with envy because you're supposed to pity them for their lack of real accomplishment. This guilt prevents you from honestly examining whether your choices were wise. And because the guilt is so powerful, you develop elaborate defense mechanisms. You convince yourself that you don't actually regret anything. You tell yourself stories about how you're actually happier than those other people, even though the evidence of your own experience suggests otherwise. Nietzsche wrote that, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." The problem for many married men is that their why has been provided by society rather than chosen by themselves. They're living for their family because that's what they're supposed to do, not because they've determined that this particular why is the one that gives their life meaning. And a borrowed why, a purpose that's been given to you rather than discovered by you, can never provide the kind of deep satisfaction that makes life feel worthwhile. So you have these men grinding through decades of existence for a purpose they never really chose, and the regret that creates is profound, because they never even had the opportunity to discover what their authentic purpose might have been. The institution of marriage also prevents what Nietzsche considered essential: solitude. He believed that profound thinking, creative work, and psychological development all require extensive time alone, free from the demands and distractions of others. But married life, especially with children, makes extended solitude nearly impossible. You're never alone. There's always someone needing something, someone you're supposed to be attending to, someone whose presence prevents you from descending into the kind of deep introspection that produces insight and growth. The married man might get an hour here or there, but he never gets the weeks or months of uninterrupted solitude that Nietzsche saw as necessary for becoming who you're capable of becoming. Nietzsche also recognized that greatness often requires what he called pathos of distance, the ability to separate yourself from the herd, to stand apart from common values and perspectives. But marriage pulls you into the herd. It makes you invested in conventional values because your entire life is structured around them. You can't develop true pathos of distance when you're embedded in the most conventional social structure that exists. You can't think radically different thoughts when your life depends on maintaining systems that assume conventional values. The married man who might have been capable of original thinking or revolutionary work instead becomes someone who thinks and works within well-established boundaries, because stepping outside them would threaten everything. The regret reaches its apex in what Nietzsche might call the moment of complete honesty, if such a moment ever comes. This is when a man finally admits to himself, without defense mechanisms or rationalizations, that saying "I do" was a mistake. Not that he chose the wrong person, but that choosing it all was wrong for him. That he was capable of something greater than domestic life but traded that possibility for security and approval. That he spent decades living a life that wasn't his, pursuing goals that weren't his, becoming a person he never wanted to be. This moment of complete honesty is devastating because it comes with the recognition that it's too late to do anything about it. The life that could have been is now impossible. The person you could have become is now inaccessible. You've run out the clock becoming someone else's version of you. Nietzsche believed that suffering could be meaningful if it served growth and self-overcoming. But that suffering in service of mediocrity was the worst kind of tragedy. The married man suffers. He sacrifices his time, his freedom, his potential, his dreams. But what does this suffering produce? Often just maintenance of the status quo. He's not suffering to create something extraordinary or become something greater. He's suffering to keep a household running, to maintain a certain standard of living, to meet social expectations. This suffering in service of the ordinary, this sacrifice that produces nothing exceptional, Nietzsche would view as the ultimate waste of human potential. The darkest truth that Nietzsche understood is that most people prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. The married man who deeply regrets his choice will almost never admit it, even to himself, because the truth is too destabilizing. It's more comfortable to believe the lies, to believe that he's happy when he's not, to believe that his sacrifices were meaningful when they weren't, to believe that he made the right choice when he didn't. And society supports these lies enthusiastically, because honest married men, men who openly discuss their regrets and the costs of domestication, would make it much harder to convince the next generation to make the same choices. Nietzsche also wrote about the death of God, by which he meant the collapse of traditional religious frameworks that had given life meaning for centuries. He recognized that this created a crisis because people no longer knew where to find meaning or purpose. And one of the things that rushed in to fill this meaning vacuum was the ideology of family. When God died, family became the new God, the new source of ultimate meaning and purpose. But Nietzsche would argue that this is a false God, an idol that demands human sacrifice, specifically the sacrifice of individual potential, but provides no genuine transcendence or transformation in return. The married man worships at the altar of family, giving it everything, but ultimately finds that it can't provide the kind of deep meaning that makes existence feel worthwhile. The regret of saying "I do" isn't universal. Nietzsche recognized that different people have different natures, different potentials, different paths. There probably are men for whom marriage is genuinely the right choice, who find fulfillment in domestic life, who aren't sacrificing significant potential by choosing that path. But Nietzsche would argue that these men are rare. For most men, especially those capable of exceptional achievement or profound self-development, marriage is fundamentally incompatible with becoming their highest selves. And the tragedy is that most of these men don't realize this until after they've already made the choice, after they're already locked in, after it's already too late. Nietzsche's final lesson about marriage and regret is this: you cannot serve two masters. You cannot simultaneously pursue excellence and pursue domestic stability. You cannot become your highest self while your primary obligation is to maintain comfort for others. You cannot live dangerously while you're risk-averse out of family obligation. At some point, you have to choose, and the biggest regret comes not from choosing wrongly in some abstract sense, but from choosing based on what others expect rather than what your deepest nature demands. The man who says "I do" because everyone expects him to, because it's the next step, because not doing it would be too uncomfortable socially, that man has betrayed himself at the most fundamental level. And some part of him will always know it, will always carry that knowledge like a wound that never quite heals. The question Nietzsche would pose to every married man is simple but brutal. If you could go back to the moment before you said "I do," knowing everything you know now, would you still say it? And here's what makes this question so devastating. If the honest answer is no, then you're living a life you wouldn't choose, and you're going to continue living it until you die because the costs of escape are too high. You've volunteered for a prison sentence. and the sentence is life. That's the regret Nietzsche saw, the one that almost no married man will ever admit openly, but that shows itself in 1,000 small ways, in the eyes that have lost their light, in the dreams that have been carefully murdered, in the resignation that masquerades as maturity, in the slow transformation from someone extraordinary into someone ordinary, from someone becoming into someone static, from someone alive into someone waiting to die. Now I need something from you, and it requires courage. Comment below with complete honesty. If you could go back to before you made your major life commitment, knowing what you know now about who you've become and what you've given up, would you make the same choice? Don't perform for others. Don't give the answer you think you should give. Tell the truth. Because acknowledging regret is the first step toward either making peace with it or doing something about it while you still have time. Subscribe to this channel immediately because we're discussing truths that are forbidden in almost every other space. We're applying Nietzsche's brutal honesty to the institutions everyone else treats as sacred, giving you permission to think thoughts you've been trained not to think, and acknowledge feelings you've been taught to suppress. This isn't content for people who want comfortable lies. This is for people who can handle uncomfortable truths. Hit subscribe now because understanding these philosophical frameworks might be the only thing that prevents you from sleepwalking through a life you never consciously chose. Smash that like button because this video threatens one of society's most protected narratives, and it needs to reach men before they make irreversible choices based on social pressure rather than honest self-examination. Your like pushes this to someone who's being pushed toward marriage without understanding what he's actually agreeing to. Someone who needs to hear Nietzsche's warning before it's too late. Every like potentially saves someone from decades of regret by giving them the philosophical tools to think clearly about the most important decision of their life. Keep watching because the next video reveals the one path Nietzsche identified for those who've already made the choice and are living with regret. We're going to explore how to reclaim pieces of your potential, even within constrained circumstances, how to create meaning even when your life structure seems to prevent it, and how to avoid completely wasting whatever time you have left. This might be the most important content you ever encounter, because it addresses the question that haunts millions of men. What do you do when you've made a choice you regret but can't undo? The answer exists, and you need to hear it.